We're running a little bit behind, but I'm sure we can make up some time. Always find some get some questions and interaction. That is always a good thing. Certainly for me, certainly just in the session we've had this morning, definitely some themes that are emerging for me from James and Alan about justice not being fair, to Malcolm's comment about justice needs to be fair, and for me that just highlights absolutely nobody's interest for people not to be properly supported when they come into custody, and for people not to be able to communicate effectively around that, because actually nobody wins from that. Certainly for me, some interesting facets of Malcolm's presentation, the 28% self-declared around mental health, and I suppose some debate as to whether that's high or low, and I suppose that's something we might want to come back to. The thing that struck me though was no way to determine how many people who come into custody have learning disability. For me there's issues about how that might be at least flagged onto databases and things to help people when they come through again. But I think Malcolm's key point for me was there really needs to be a reliable way to identify those people who come into custody who have learning disability. And again, the important part about how you highlight those approaches and talking about screening tools. And it's just that seamless link around screening tools and links. For me, great pleasure to introduce Iain McKinnon. Dr. Iain McKinnon is a consultant psychiatrist in forensic learning disability with Northumberland, Tyne and Weir NHS Foundation Trust. He is also an honorary senior clinical lecturer at Newcastle University, and among a range of clinical research interests, he has led the development of police custody risk assessment screening with the Metropolitan Police in London. That work formed the basis of his PhD to improve the detection of health morbidities and vulnerabilities among police custody detainees. The new risk assessment processes have been implemented by Northumbria Police and are now in the process of being evaluated, and Iain is also in the working group of the Home Office looking at the provision of appropriate adults in England and Wales. So very, very well qualified, Iain. Delighted to have you here today. No pressure then. So
I'll let these people be the judge of that. Okay, thank you very much. Well, thanks a lot for inviting me along. It's a real pleasure to come up the road to Edinburgh to speak to you today, and when I was asked to do so by Tony, I jumped at the chance, although Dr. Dowds did agree to take me out for a slap-up meal this evening, but he has since reneged on that promise. And those of you who know Dr. Dowds will probably know what I'm talking about. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about screening tools, because having read through your report from the last conference and done a lot about screening in the past, this is quite a controversial area, and it's always opens up a lot of debate about whether we screen, whether we don't screen, whether we do something different, how we do the identification of people who have a range of vulnerabilities in a police station or a prison or in an AD department or whatever. And I think if I give you the answers to my working out, the answer is it's not easy to come to any kind of conclusion that everyone is very happy with. What I'd like to tell you a little bit about today is kind of the work that we've done and where we came from and where we've got to at the moment with the current police work. It's not a definitive endpoint, but I think it's probably better positioned than we were at perhaps 10 years ago with this. But as I say, I'll let you be the judge of that at the end, and please feel free to ask me any questions. So I was going to talk about sort of screening generally and what's done and by whom and what for. Talk a little bit about detainees with vulnerability, because this is coming up all the time, certainly in my work with the Home Office. Well, what exactly is vulnerability, and who are the people we need to be sort of picking up? Screening tools used in custody, what's been used in the past, especially around the sort of mental vulnerability and people with intellectual and developmental disability. And I'm using that term as a slightly wider term than just learning disability. I'll tell you a little bit about the Help PC project. That's my project that looked to redevelop the risk assessment, and maybe have a look at what we're doing at the moment, some future developments around that. Okay, so the question is sort of, what screening do we do and who does it? So top left-hand corner, you've got a police sergeant, a custody officer in England and Wales, I can't remember, it's similar terminology in Scotland as well. The officer in charge in the Republic of Ireland. And actually, certainly in some jurisdictions, there is a statutory responsibility for the police sergeant to risk assess each individual as they come into custody to ensure their health and welfare. But there are sort of questions raised about, well, actually, should that really screening for health and welfare issues really be the role of the custody sergeant? Shouldn't it be someone else? What about a custody nurse, like in the bottom right-hand corner, working in collaboration with the police? And this is a debate that sort of rages and is ongoing, really. So there's the types of screening that's been done in police custody in terms of the research evidence. Well, we've been looking specifically at the police risk assessment, which is a screening tool in itself. But there's also been other projects done where screening by researchers, so for example, looking to screen for how many people coming to the police custody have a learning disability, how many people have ADHD, how many people young people have a conduct disorder. Also screening done around mental health problems, psychosis, bipolar disorder. Much less research done by researchers on physical health problems, interestingly. We've tried to kind of incorporate some of the physical health stuff into the risk assessment work that we've done. Then there's the screening done by healthcare professionals, and that will take on all sorts of different forms depending on which healthcare professionals are providing that role in the custody suite. So a liaison diversion team, mental health team might do predominantly screening for mental health problems. The physical health teams in England, we have contracts every 3 years and no sort of no institutional memory of what goes on. So they might do their own screening around asthma, diabetes, etc., etc. But the particular bit that we've been sort of concentrating on is the police risk assessment, the actual screening that's done on every detainee that comes through the door. So what are they screening for? Well, physical healthcare and injuries, around immediate management in custody, making sure that you guys with diabetes aren't going to go into a diabetic coma potentially. People with epilepsy get their anticonvulsant medication, for example. And there's an element of vulnerability in there as well. Issues around substances, so be those medical emergencies associated with intoxication, new psychoactive substances, drugs and alcohol, and also the potential for alcohol withdrawal syndrome, which is of course a medical emergency as well. But there's also the opportunity to screen there for providing brief interventions for people who have alcohol dependence, and there's a whole body of work on that. And then you have mental disorders and suicide risk. And mental disorders, certainly from legal and statutory point of view, covers a whole multitude of things: psychosis, mental illness, intellectual and developmental disability, autism, and personality disorder potentially. And some of this screening in police custody is around dealing with psychiatric emergencies, safe detention, what interventions might be put into place by your healthcare professionals, and then looking at more longitudinal treatment. What if that person's going to end up in the criminal justice system? Is there an opportunity to screen and flag that up at that point, and then take that information through the system? And then diversion of people who perhaps also have a mental health requirement on top of a criminal justice disposal requirement as well. But all of these things form part, along with other things, of the police risk assessment. I've missed out a few other bits and pieces that need to be done in a police custody suite. And this is the area we've been sort of concentrating on. So what about detainees with vulnerability? Who are they? Who are these people who have vulnerability? And this debate seems to be raging quite actively, certainly in the Home Office. What's the definition? Is it not everyone who comes into a police custody suite who's vulnerable from one sense or another? And where do you sort of draw the line, and how do you delineate who is and who isn't vulnerable? What about the guy who comes in with psychopathic disorder, who is callous, cold, and quite manipulative, with an IQ of about 150, 160? Are they vulnerable in the same sense that someone who has a learning disability or autism coming into a police custody suite is? Do we base it on diagnosis? There are arguments for and very strong arguments against that. What about disabilities? Which ones? And would someone with a mild physical disability be offended if we said that they were vulnerable in some way? because I've come across that before. Is it about the nature of the alleged charges? What's the difference between someone who comes in who's been charged with drunk and disorderly compared to, say, the teacher who comes in to custody because they've been caught downloading illegal pornography, for example? So they're potentially another vulnerable group with life-changing charges there. And then issues around, certainly in England and Wales, codes of practice for PACE. I'm aware that there are moves afoot around the criminal justice bill here in Scotland as well, and how that will impact on definitions potentially of vulnerability. We're looking at the literature in police custody. A lot of this work actually does emanate from these islands, and much of it from London. I have to add, a lot of this work's been looking at vulnerable detainees and what is the prevalence potentially of learning disability, what are we doing about it, how do we square that circle between Police and Criminal Evidence Act codes and also the people who've got these diagnoses. There's only really one piece of work that's attempted to properly quantify the prevalence of learning disability, and that's the work done by Clare and Goodjohnson in 1995, where they went into police custody suites in London and actually did IQ tests. Now that's not a diagnosis for a learning disability, but it was really sort of highlighting the difficulties of actually doing that work to establish a gold standard for people who have a learning disability in custody. I have patients at Northgate Hospital in Northumberland. We've had some of them in for a couple of years doing offence-related treatment, and we're still not sure whether they have a learning disability or not, despite doing all of the standardised tests. So identification is a real issue and a real problem. More recently, there's been some work done around using Karen Mackenzie, who was an academic here in Edinburgh, now working at Northumbria, the Learning Disability Screening Questionnaire. And that is a tool that's been validated in community settings. There's been some validation in offender-related settings as well, but it hasn't been validated in police custody. But certainly, one study by Young et al. In 2013, Susie Young in London, they used that on about 100 to 200 detainees and found a prevalence of learning disability of around about 7 to 10%. When it was used in a study in Yorkshire by Anna Middlemas and unpublished work, it was around about 3 or 4%. So again, a range of issues there. So, thinking about learning disability and that sort of intellectual and developmental disability vulnerability specifically, there has been some work done previously in this country, I say this country, I mean the UK, around screening. And Isabel Clare, who I mentioned earlier, Clare and Goodjohnson, actually developed some questions to go into the Metropolitan Police's risk assessments. Now, risk assessments vary from force to force across the UK. It can depend on a number of factors, and the evidence base for those questions that they use within the risk assessment is quite unclear in many cases. Often there's a committee deciding on what the questions are going to be, and it's often prescribed in which custody software that particular police force had chosen to use. So, for example, about 10 years ago in England and Wales, half the forces used a system called NSPIS. It had a set of questions, and those questions were basically decided by every 18 months by a committee at a cost of £1 million every time they changed the question. There are now other choices for software. Northumbria Police never had a software system, and that's partly why they've been able to implement the work that we've done, because they've built it from the ground up. But other forces who do use standard software systems have difficulty in actually making any changes to the risk assessments that they do, and that's a real problem for them. Then custody healthcare teams probably use a range of instruments depending on what particular bit of healthcare they're focusing in on. This is the work of Isabel Clare, and they did this in the late 90s, and they did this with in a community setting. They looked at the sensitivity and specificity of various questions to work out whether it was going to hit the people who needed an appropriate adult in a police custody suite. And it was as simple as that, really. The police were asked to ask the detainees if they had the special help with reading problems, special help for people who have learning difficulties or learning disabilities, and special help for people to a special school. And there's also a fourth question around mental illness there. And that's pretty straightforward, and that was being used by the Met Police for a number of years. And then when they computerised the system in about 2000, these questions suddenly disappeared and got lost. I managed to find them. They were in the custody log, but they weren't part of the actual standard questions that custody officers were forced to ask at the beginning. As I said to you before, the Learning Disability Screening Questionnaire has also been used. Susie Young's work, about 7% of the prevalence of learning disability, and Anna Middleton's study, which is unpublished, which is about 3%. But again, it's not been validated in police stations. This was an example of a questionnaire that was developed in northwest London by Scott Galloway and Salma Ali, again an unpublished piece of work. They developed a liaison diversion service for people with learning disabilities, and they developed this questionnaire based on, this was really focus groups that developed this in the end, and the score of greater than 5 warranted a further assessment. Again, it's not been validated against a gold standard, but it was used for their both police and their magistrates court group of individuals, and we used it in our as part of our pilot for our assessment of detainees with learning disability. So a handful of things there, but nothing that's been definitively validated in a police custody setting. Surprise, surprise. Okay. This is the piece of work that we did. Now, it's been ongoing now for nearly 10 years. I first got involved in it in 2009. And this was, my PhD supervisor was approached by the Met Police to look at their screening. They said, we're not sure it's working very well, can you do something about it? And he said, well, no, I've got no one to do the legwork for me, and I came along looking for a project, so Muggins here got the job of looking at that. So we evaluated the NSPIS risk assessment the Met were using at the time. We presented that data to the Met. We said, is this good enough for you? And they went, no. So we said, what do you want us to do? We said, can you develop something for us? And I managed to get some money at the time to do my PhD, luckily, and based on this project, and we developed and piloted a new risk assessment for them. Now, bear in mind, the risk assessment is not just about learning disabilities. The risk assessment is meant to be help across the board, so it was a pretty big project. When we evaluated their standard screening tool, we found that they were, of the people that we interviewed in the custody suite, they were picking up about half of people with asthma, 2/3 of the people with diabetes, about 1/5 of the people who we thought had a serious head injury, which is a significant concern, and about 80% of people who, they're doing quite well, people with psychosis actually, but that's probably because they're the barn door sort of presentations of people with serious mental illness. In terms of other vulnerable groups, around about 1/3, I'll come on to learning disability in a second. And rather worryingly, they were only picking up about 1/2 of people who we thought were at risk of alcohol withdrawal syndrome, and people who had elevated scores on standardised suicide risk scores. Of the 250 people we saw, we were suspicious that 8 had a learning disability as their primary mental health problem, their primary health problem, and the police picked up 1/4 of those. Although 7 of the 8 had an appropriate adult call, but they had appropriate adults called for other reasons. It wasn't the learning disability particularly that was picked up at the time. So we developed, and Inspector Fiona Bell will be aware of this piece of work. This was a screening tool that we developed on the computer with the Met. The Met, unfortunately, wouldn't commit to any IT funding to do this, so the guy who we got to do it within the Met did it in his spare time. He mocked up this risk assessment for us because he was so interested in the way that the form worked. So there you go, that tells you a lot about the guy, that he was prepared to do that. And as you can see, it's divided up into lots of different sections, including learning disability and including mental health and all the other things along there as well. I'm not going to show you this, what this form looks like. It's very complex and long and convoluted. But what it did do when we redid the evaluation using that risk assessment, we found that we managed to improve the detection rate of quite a number of those things. Still a bit worried about head injuries. They were still picking up less than half of those, so that needs a bit of work on it. But what they were doing a lot better was they were doing a lot better with the other vulnerable detainees, a little bit, quite a bit better with people with psychosis as well, nearly 100% there, and doing a lot better with the some of the physical health problems as well, and the people at risk of suicide as well. And those people who we were concerned were going to fit and go into DTs, they were doing a lot better with those as well. And this is simply by having a bit of a structure to the risk assessment compared to what they were using before, which was very much so just a couple of questions, yes or no answers, make your own mind up. This risk assessment actually gives the custody officers a guide as to what to do if they pick these things up. For the learning disability screening questionnaires, we found there were about 5 discriminating factors that discriminated between the people who did and the people who didn't have a learning disability based on our clinical judgment. So previous contact with LD services, special schooling, being unable to read, that's self-report. People who'd had extra help in class, special schools, there's similar things coming here to previously. Current or prior involvement with learning disability services or psychiatrist, and having a reading age of less than 10 years and 3 months on the Chanel graded word reading test. That's a test that was developed locally in Edinburgh here, and we found that actually people who scored less than 10 years 3 months on that were more likely to have a learning disability than not. So this was the learning disability part of the tool. And what I can't show you here is the interactivity here. If you click yes, there are further questions to drill down into that. If you click yes, yes or no here, then there are further questions. And special school, there are further questions about that as well. Even if all these are no, and the custody officer thinks that the person actually has genuine difficulty understanding, following the flow, memory problems, in the absence of intoxication, then they can flag that up as well. This is also used in connection with the mental health section of this screening tool as well, which again we used some observational cues for the sergeants that were based on previous evidence. So was the person muddled? Was the person saying things that were strange or unusual? Again, I can't show you it on here, but when I come to the Northumbria tool, all this stuff's been actually put together in one vulnerability section. Let's just go over that. That's boring stats. So actually, they picked up 5 of the 6 we thought had a learning disability with using this. So it's only small numbers and probably doesn't mean very much. But what we found that actually the false positive rate went up as well. So they were picking up people who didn't have a learning disability with using the learning disability screening tool, and that's the problem with these tools. You improve the sensitivity, you improve the true positive rate, but you also increase the false positive rate as well. But we found that even people who were false positives on the learning disability part of the questionnaire, actually a lot of them all had other mental disorders as well. So okay, it's not specific for learning disability, but actually it's picking up more of the people you're really worried about, is one argument. We also validated it in our inpatient group as well, so 60 inpatients from our forensic and our forensic learning disability service, and we found a decent sensitivity and specificity there, but again, it's a very specific group there. Now then, Northumbria Police have implemented this now. And what they've done is they put the mental health questions and the learning disability questions together in one vulnerability section. So you've got a question about mental health issues, whether they've got medication for this, whether they've seen specialist mental health services recently, and then questions about difficulties reading and writing, Did they receive extra help at school? And have they ever had contact with learning disability services? And then the 5 prompts from the mental health section plus the prompts from the learning disability section are all together there. So rather than kind of separating learning disability and mental health problems out, which again is slightly controversial, we've put them all in together to have a vulnerability section. We're going to see how this is working out for them, because we're not sure yet. We're doing the evaluation at the moment. Okay, future developments. So, well, the Met Police are planning to implement it, but they can't at the moment because they're still shopping around for their custody software package that may or may not be able to actually put this into it. But Northumbria, as I said, they didn't have their own software package. They actually developed their own, so they were able to put this into it. And currently in negotiations with Police Scotland about using bits of it, mucking around with it, making it, what did you say, Fiona? Tartanised. But bearing in mind that this is not an end point. This is actually an iteration, I think, and I think that it's important that we make sure that we learn from mistakes from this and that we make it right. What it doesn't do is it doesn't go into any of those things that were raised at your previous meeting around how do you assess communication skills, how do you go about doing a wider thing. This is a screening tool, and it is not intended to make diagnoses. It is not intended to go about finding out what people's reading level is, what their abilities are, etc., etc. And I've never made any claims that it does. So that is obviously for obviously part of the discussion as well. Remember, this is part of a wider risk assessment around picking up health needs, physical health problems, etc., etc. And it will need a wider evaluation, and have a look at the sort of clinical, economic and service impact evaluations. And that will differ depending on jurisdiction as well, because the clinical services are very different in different parts of the UK. Can we do a robust evaluation of the learning disability questions? I think that's probably going to be a separate evaluation, because that's determining a gold standard for learning disability in a police custody suite is one thing, against which to judge the questions. And what's the most appropriate methodology? Is it quantitative, is it qualitative, is it mixed methods? Who does it? Do we need an independent sort of assessment of this? Those are all things to think about there. Crikey. There's a lot to take in. I think the overall message is that I think we've come a long way in 10 years from where we were at with the Met, with their very, very brief screening questionnaires. So actually having something dedicated to mental health and learning disability within the risk assessment is now actually actively being used by the police force. It's by no means an end point. I think it's just a stepping stone on the way to doing something better. So thank you for listening. Invite back.